For I mean, sorry. I'll give you more shots.
Yes.
It's nice to see so many faces here on this sweltering day. I hope to make it a great deal harder for this talk. Let's see if that works. The subject I was asked to speak on was postcolonial theory, which continues to be a. Can you all hear me? The subject I was asked to speak on was postcolonial theory and its ongoing relevance or irrelevance, depending on your perspective. I will try to speak on its relevance, but therefore also its great danger. If it were irrelevant, we wouldn't have to worry about it. What I'm going to speak on is, as the topic said, postcolonial theory and global crises today. Because if postcolonial theory is true to its word, which is that it is the inheritor of the mantle of radicalism that socialism and Marxism once claimed for itself, it should have something to say about the crises of the day, about the politically relevant issues today. And I'll focus on two in particular. One is the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the second is the rise of the far right. Now, I'll concentrate on the West, on the United States and Europe, but I hope it has some relevance with the continuing and abiding power of the far right, perhaps in this country as well. So, I will not dither too long on the internal structure of postcolonial theory, because I've written on this quite a bit, and I have several videos up on YouTube as well, in which I have a more detailed criticism of it. But in order to be fair in one's assessment of it, one does have to, even in this occasion, say something about what its core claims are, and give a brief assessment of those claims, which again will be rather brief, but will rely on, and I hope, point you toward the longer critiques that I've made more carefully and more elaborately elsewhere. So we want to know whether postcolonial theory can assess and address the major crises of the day, the two which I have said in particular. We start by asking, what is postcolonial theory, what are its main claims? I should start by saying this is always a kind of a fraught task, because the theory is set up to be immune to criticism, because it's so turgid, so impenetrable, so resistant to doing what serious academic does, which is to lay out its arguments carefully so that they might be assessed. The problem is that any time you lay out a criticism, the riposte is, well, you haven't understood us, that's not what the theory says, that's not the important theorist, etc., etc. So it's a risky venture. But I do believe that the two claims I'm going to lay out as being central to its corpus are rather unexceptional. That is to say, if these claims were not central to postcolonial theory, it's hard to imagine why the theory exists at all. So the first one is the claim that Vivek Chibber says over and over and over again in Provincializing Europe, which is, I think, the sociological core of the theory, which is that capitalism in the 20th century globalized, but it did not universalize. I do not think it's possible to deny that this is a central claim that, of course, that Chakrabarti makes, but it also extends to the rest of the corpus. The second claim, again, which I think is utterly uncontroversial with respect to the corpus, is that all universalizing categories, or what they call master narratives, are to be rejected, or at least should warrant a high degree of skepticism. The reason is that all such master narratives do two things. They occlude and obscure the specificities of local cultures, and hence, by definition, therefore, also of the local culture of colonial societies, which is so different from the West, which is where these categories originated. The second thing they do is they suppress agency. Why do they suppress agency? Because in denying the reality of the lived experience of people in the global South, by denying the salience of the local categories that emerge from their own practice, it denies them the right to understand their practice through their own epistemological categories. And of course, you deny them their own local knowledge, you're going to deny them the awareness of their situation through which they might be effective agents. Therefore, it suppresses agency. The two claims. One is that capitalism did not universalize itself, and the second is that master narratives and universalization is to be at least very skeptical of, if not rejected. I think this is pretty uncontroversial. All right. So we want to see how these two claims fare when they are put under scrutiny. The second thing you want to know is, can a theory that abides by these claims explain and help us engage with the crises of our time? Clear? I usually say interrupt me if you don't understand anything, but actually don't. Interrupt me at the end when there'll be question and answers, because once one interjection comes in, it's like a dam break, that everybody wants to say something. So in order to be fair to all the listeners, let's try to hold back until the end. All right, so let's start with these two claims and see if they stand up to critique on their own terms before we go to the political implications. Start with the idea that capitalism has not universalized, even though it's globalized. It's puzzling when you first encounter it. What could it possibly mean? If it's globalized, it means it's spread. If it's spread, it means it's everywhere. If it's everywhere, it means it's universal. So how can you intuitively, how can you globalize without universalizing? Well, the claim from Chakrabarti appears to be that some elements of capitalism have in fact spread across the world, but the causal properties and the outcome that we associate with it have not. But what is the chief such causal property? And I should say, it's not just Chakrabarti who says this, it actually comes from Rajiv Guha. Guha says that when capital left the West, I'm quoting it abandoned its universalizing mission. What he means by that is capital, and when it came to colonies, did not do the same sorts of things that it did in the West. Two such things in particular, Guha says, it didn't democratize the culture, and the second is it didn't transform social relations as it did in the West. Now, I'm not going to address the issue of democratization in the lecture, although I'm happy to take it up in question and answers, because Guha is fundamentally wrong in the history of bourgeoisie in the West. Let's take up, though, the issue of whether its properties were adequately universalized when it came to the global South. What does Chakrabarti mean by this? He means something very specific, which is that it did not transform all social relations so that they became subordinate to the logic of capital. It did not transform all social relations so that they became subordinate to the logic of capital. Okay, now this is a very specific test for whether or not capitalism is universalized. It means that wherever it goes, every part of the social totality, every part of the social integument should become, in some way or form, subordinate to the logic of capital. Well, what's the logic of capital? Here, there's no doubt. It is what Marx called the self-valorization of capital. The production of value and the expansion of value as an end in itself. In everyday terms, we would call it the logic of profit maximization. So what capital does when it goes across the world is that it seeks to maximize profits regardless of the culture that it's in. And Chakrabarti is implying that in the drive to maximize profits, it should transform all social relations. And he says, well, look, this hasn't happened. What is the evidence it hasn't happened? There's still a lot of superstition in India. Workers pray while they're working. There's still the salience of religion, etc., etc. Okay, well, of course, this ends up being a test that no country passes, not just India. It's a test that quintessentially bourgeois culture also failed to pass. You find plenty of superstition in the United States. You find plenty of religiosity in the United States. Same thing in Europe. You find plenty of community organizations, community-oriented, some consciousness in the West. The problem with Chakrabarti is he puts a test to the universalization of capital that not only no culture can withstand, but which also no Marxist ever said it had. If the universalization of capital means the universalization of profit maximization, then the only social relations capital has to transform in order to fulfill its mission, in order to universalize, is those social relations which stand in the way of profit making. Indeed, in the pursuit of profits, we might find capitalism strengthening certain antediluvian and certain what's called pre-capitalist cultural forms and also social relations. In this goal of maximizing profit, it might amplify religiosity. There's something called the Birla temperament. Birla didn't make this because he ceased to be a capitalist. He made it because he was a capitalist. There's a long history of this. It's so basic, it's so obvious, it doesn't need any kind of stressing. The puzzle is why Chakravarti would make such an outlandish claim at all. I mean, he never told us why, but he did make the claim. The basic problem with the thesis that capitalism does not universalize is that it proceeds with an exceedingly ambitious and expansive notion of what universalization means. No Marxist, no liberal ever thought that's what it means, and indeed there is no basis to agree that that's what it means because it fails on its own terms. All of subaltern studies, all of post-colonial theory, whether it's the Latin Americanists, Mignolo and Quijano, whether it's the Indians, all of them agree that the West is capitalist. All of them agree that capital in the West did universalize. But once you agree with that, you also have to accommodate with that there's plenty of those very same phenomena which they take to be contradictory to capitalism in the very heart of capitalism. Which means the theory fails on its own terms. It simply fails. All right. That being the case, we can agree that capitalism, in fact, has universalized. Well, if it has universalized, what does it mean? Well, one thing it means is that there's a spread in the profit motive, so that regardless of religion, regardless of socialization, regardless of region or culture, this is what capitalists do. They maximize profits. But it also has another meaning, which is that those who are subject to the drive of capital, those who are under its thumb, are now also exposed to particular liabilities and particular experiences, which is what? Being subordinated to capital, being exploited by capital, subject to the insecurity that comes with it, subject to the poverty that often comes with it. These are all things that are part of the universal drive of capital. On the one hand, the maximization of profits, and on the other hand, the subjection of populations to the exploitation and domination that comes with it, regardless of their culture and regardless of their religion. They themselves subordinate themselves to it because there's no other choice for them. They want to make a living, they have to show up and work for a wage. There are therefore these two dimensions to that drive. What happens to the ruling classes, what happens to the subordinate classes. That's all part of universalization. So the second question we take up now is what do you do about it? In what way do you resist these assaults on the well-being of the vast majority of the population? Well, traditional Marxism and traditional socialism had an answer, which is you try to organize them around their common interests. You try to organize them to defend their well-being, which is universal, against the universal onslaught of their employers. The problem here is we come up against the second core claim of post-colonial theory, which is that universal categories are to be rejected. What are these universal categories? Human nature, universal human needs, common material interests. In fact, the very idea of material interests is taken to be problematic because interests are supposed to be culturally material. They're constructed through local cultures, local discourses. Human rights, it's a universal discourse, and it is explicitly attacked by post-colonial theory, including Arab post-colonial theorists as being a Western construction. All of these are denied. Well, if all of these are denied, then what do you have left to struggle with? What you have left is the internal, communal, religious, custom-based norms that the East is supposed to be comfortable with. The problem here is this, as I show in my books, when post-colonial theorists seek to explain the logic of peasant society in the global south and the history of that peasant society, they end up contradicting their own claims about the consciousness of Indian, Arab, or Middle Eastern, Latin American peasants. They insist that these peasants are not motivated by material interests or individual interests, but in fact, what their own work shows is the motivation by such material interest is universal in two ways. Chatterjee's work shows that these mostly community-oriented peasants were very active, usurping and stealing land from their co-inhabitants in the same village. Well, how do you do that if your primary motivation is community orientation? You are putting your individual interests above the interests of other community members. Secondly, Chatterjee's own work and Chakrabarti's work on the Indian working class shows that resistance is along material lines. If it's along material lines, if they're fighting for their autonomy, if they're fighting for lower rents, If they're fighting for higher wages, they are fighting for their material interests. If that's the case, their own work shows that the very same universal categories that are supposed to be rejected are in fact central to the work of the subalternists and the postcolonial theorists themselves. So just as in the case of the universalization of capital, the universalization, the salience, or if you are taking their stance, the dubiousness of universalizing categories leads to them contradicting their own assertions when they do their empirical work. The theory simply can't stand up to scrutiny. Now, I'm being a little bit cryptic here. It's a short argument because I want to move on to other things, and I've made these arguments at length elsewhere. I'm simply giving you a flavor for what the basic problems are so that you can examine them, investigate them yourselves. I think if you come to the books with these sort of questions in mind, it's simply indisputable. The theory has no leg to stand on for the very questions it asks. Questions being, how do we understand the specificity of colonial history and of the anti-colonial movements? All right, if their own work contradicts the claims that they're making, the theory is collapsing by its own internal contradictions. But there's also an external dimension, which is, even if we don't assess it by its internal coherence, how does it help us engage the world around us? Because, again, since it has a claim to the mantle of radicalism, it means it should be able to improve political agency. So if political agency then requires that we step outside the strictures of post-colonial theory, it is yet another way in which the theory fails to address the world around us. All right, so what are some key issues that it might take up? These two that I brought up so far, the Israel-Palestine issue and then the rise of the farmer. I want to see whether or not the current movement in support of Palestinian rights is consistent with the strictures of post-colonial theory, or whether it is, in fact, intentional. Let's start with an observation. In all the global upsurge, the rallies, the student blockades, the student occupations, everything, what is the one assertion that comes up over and over and over again about Israel? It's simple. That in carrying out its ethnic cleansing or its genocide, and I think by now it's pretty clear that it's a genocide, in carrying it out, Israel is denying the humanity of the Palestinians. You see this over and over and over again. They're denying the humanity of the Palestinians. It is an attack on the humanity of the Palestinians. Every single corner of the solidarity movement uses this language, including all those students in Columbia University and Yale and all that, the prized children of the subalternists and Middle East studies on. But if your criticism of the Israeli genocide and the American press that's defending them, and Biden who's supplying them their bombs, if your criticism is that they're denying the humanity of the Palestinians, you have conceded that debate. Because to deny the humanity means there is something in common that they have with the rest of humanity. If you are saying that it is on the basis of their humanity that we empathize with them, that we think they deserve better, it means you are saying they have something in common with us, which means you are asserting that there is a common set of needs and a common set of aspirations between you as an Indian or American or British with these Muslims and Christians in the Arab world, regardless of their cultural differences with you, regardless of their locality. Means you are asserting and affirming a common human nature, a universalizing phenomenon, a universal category of human needs and human aspirations explicitly denied by post-colonial theory. It means that in carrying out the defense of the Palestinians, you are reverting back to those very enlightenment categories, the very universalizing categories that we're supposed to be rejecting, even while, and I'll come to this in a second, even while you explain and you address the politics of it through ethnicity, indigeneity, race, etc., which are the beloved categories of post-colonial theory. In other words, there is a schizophrenia today within the Palestine solidarity movement. Because so many of the students and so many of the academics defending them insist on describing the problems of the Palestinians in ethnic and racial terms, while at the same time defending them in liberal and universalist terms. They have no coherent discourse to which to engage the world politically. Let me deepen this a little bit more. Not only is it impossible to ignore the resort to common enlightenment categories used by the movement today in defending the Palestinians, it's very hard also to ignore when it comes to explaining the plight of the Palestinians. Why historically they've been unable to achieve anything near their goals. Why historically the Arab ruling classes have betrayed them at every turn. Why historically Israel has been able to continue its occupation much longer than its cousin in South Africa and other apartheid regimes. In trying to explain that, simply cannot explain it through ethnicity, indigeneity, and local cultures and local values, the way postcolonial theory enjoins them to. It can only be explained by examining the material reality of the uniqueness of Palestinian subordination, that is to say, the uniqueness of Israeli colonialism in the region. For what it be right from the start, the Palestinian movement has been hobbled by two facts. One is that it lacks any economic and political leverage against the Israelis, because unlike the South African working class, which is subject to apartheid, the Palestinian working class is a redundant, unnecessary, and surplus labor force. The South African working class was able to bring apartheid down because the South African white ruling class relied on it, depended on it. So when it engaged in economic disruption, it brought the entire economy down around it. After a certain amount of mobilization, the South African ruling class had no choice but to negotiate with the ANC and the SACP because of the extraordinary leverage that the working class there possessed. In Israel, on the other hand, since the 1980s and 90s, as Israel has brought in European labor and expelled Palestinian workers, they have become more akin to the American Indians in the United States, which are often a reservation and have absolutely no power against them than the South African working class did against South African apartheid. You cannot understand the weakness of the Palestinian cause unless you put it in the context of the political economy, the specificity of Israeli colonialism. You cannot understand the fact that the Arab ruling classes have betrayed it at every turn if you think ethnicity and religion are the binding facts of the Middle East, because their co-ethnics and their co-religionists have turned against them since the 1960s at every turn. Why? Because the political and economic interests of the Arab ruling classes go against their rhetoric of support for the Palestinian cause. In this, the liberals have done a much better job explaining, as opposed to simply describing, the contours of Israeli colonialism than has this left-inspired by postcolonial. Let's move to the second issue, the rise of the far right. Here again, the most cherished, the most common answer coming from the cultural left is that the far right has come to power or is gaining in power because of an abiding and unerasable racism on the part of Western culture and part of America. But it was the same racism that allowed millions upon millions of recent immigrants into Europe. It was the same supposed racism that integrated them into European society and the European welfare system. Why wasn't that racism there when they were coming in? Of course, there was some, but it was the defining characteristic of European culture. It would never even have happened at all. There is now a mountain of research shown that the resistance or the attacks on the immigrants from the global south and the calls to blockade immigration are not pervasive across Europe. They're the strongest in certain regions. And those regions have two things in common. First of all, they're the regions in which economic downturns due to globalization have hit the working class the hardest, so that they're now frightened, insecure, and worried about their futures. But even more, the most accurate predictor of the rise of xenophobia is regions in which austerity has been imposed the most, and therefore cutbacks in social services are the most severe. There's an incredibly robust correlation in Europe and in the United States between the intensity of austerity, the intensity of the cutbacks, and the rise of anti-immigrant sentiments. This doesn't deny the salience of racism, but it does explain it. And if you think that what's behind it is an abiding, unerased, ineradicable racism, what is your program? What are you going to do to move forward? I would challenge you to find a program in any of the race-centered criticisms. They're very good at denouncing. They have absolutely no solution. Because to admit of a solution would mean that there's material causes. It would mean that you can address them, which means that you have to go against the core elements of your own theory. The only way to come out of the rise of the far right is to go back and give the European and American working classes some kind of decent livelihood, something that they can hang on to, something that gives them hope for the future, so that they are not looking to the far right as the only political formation that has any interest in them at all. It's absolutely undoubtedly true that the rise of the far right has come exactly in inverse relationship with the turn of the social democratic parties away from their traditional political programs of redistribution, of raising the living standards of the working class, and of building the welfare state. If there is any hope of recovering the possibility of a multicultural, egalitarian, and culture of mutual respect, then it have to come through a rediscovery of the ethos, the goals, and the policies that traditional socialist and labor parties were committed to for close to 100 years. I will submit to you, I have not yet seen a single political program coming out of the cultural left that addresses the root causes of this right-wing turn in European and American culture. It all comes down always to better education, better socialization, as if these people were not already aware of the importance of anti-racism, of the importance of multiculturalism. They're rejecting it not because they're not aware of it, but because they feel it doesn't deliver to them what they need to have a decent life. Continue to demonize them. If you continue to say they are unalterably racist, they will reject you, and you will come witness the rise of the right, even as you clutch your copies of Derrida. To my mind, there's simply no question. There is no future for postcolonial theory as a guide for political action. In fact, it never has been. There has never been a moment in the history of peasant and workers' movement when something called postcolonial theory was guiding them. It didn't exist, even though they tried to create a fictitious history, saying Fanon was a post-colonialist, Cabral was a post-colonialist, blah, blah, blah. Absolutely untrue. All of them thought of themselves as socialists. All of them thought of themselves as some variant of Marxism. Post-colonial theory was not a theory coming out of political practice. It was a theory that came out of the depth of political practice. It was a theory that came out of academic institutions made for academics for their professional advancement. That's why it prioritizes these categories above all others, because these are the categories that have been useful in the upward mobility of black and brown academics at a time when jobs are shrinking and when the left and labor movements have been in retreat. I've been saying this for years and I'll say it again. It may be that the left is dead forever. It may actually be true. But if it recovers, it will go on its march back to relevance. It will have to step over the bodies of postcolonial theory, not the wrists. There is no road to liberation through it. You may or may not understand this, but those of you who are politically serious, someday you will. But those of you who are not, you will continue to clutch to the theory. And so much the worse for you and the world, unfortunately. Okay, I'll stop.
Thanks so much. It was not shown there. So, questions or comments, please.
I should stay there.
You can take a seat and I think you could open the windows because it's very
Yeah, the AC stopped working quite a while ago. Yes, me.
Yes, I'm not sure I can stop that much as long as that's what you will be. So, let's not completely agree in call out the device of because in theory I've been saying that for centuries, but I was centuries. I don't want to do it, so no, point being this, absolutely no agreement with the way in which you're breaking the code for the life, the relevance, etc. But I can make my position very important to put something on your page at all, so that I get an answer. They are not promises. I never really. Right? I'm quite norms like global things that you know, rules and all these universal things that's very lazy at doing work. Second thing is that I think that in many ways, you think like the values events and the veritas and etc. in the world, we came in with a particular theoretical or epistemological standpoint, which over a very short time periods. We came into linguistics, came to postmodernism, we came into things like that. So I'm not taking Marxism, but I'm taking, let's say, especially I'm political person, where identity, difference, etc., where the things that your values may etc., whatever, right? So I'm coming at it from that point. And I'm also going to move it against being a managing and I'm part of that business. To me, I want to think about them as history, just directly at that, right? So if I'm to give a sense of what is my current way of looking at this, I'm looking at another set of theory, which is sometimes called by politics, sometimes called by social, etc. So which is a little bit of a lot of explicit, etc. What I'm hearing you say is really a device where idea of community is not going to be possible unless we think about universalism. That seems to be the message. So my little question for you is that I'm really worried about getting the universals back to a level. Right? I think it takes you back to questions where the differences between, let's say, secular and secular, which the West then falls to the flows on the I think if there's no difference, I mean, it's piety is just another profit-making venture or another of what the British really call capitalism, right, in this country and in other stuff. I really don't see the problem there of putting religion and piety together when country is free or what country. It could like a golden grace, it is another source to that, right? That's fine. So what is the nature of the universe that you'd like to offer us? I understand going back to enlightening values of universalism, we mentioned Israel and Palestine, the possibly the appeal to the humane. But I think the humane is something that is not limited to the Latin. There's a very new configuration of the humane for the human. Right. So, which is something that comes in from a sense of the bios of the, the idea of unitas, bios, all of that. So, that's just my question. What is your combination of universal in or didn't have to go back to the fact?
Should we give you questions? Other ones. Okay, second question, any? Yeah, go on.
I have read your book in the chapter 8, which is titled Historicity, about Dipesh Chakravarty's work. You have mentioned that somehow they are turning the basics to back, like they were criticizing Orientalist theories. But you have alleged that actually they are turning back to Orientalism, like they are stereotyping the European countries. So I just want you to put some like how they are in the present context, how they we can say that they are like stereotyping Europe.
I have two questions. How do you think Soviet theory
categorize caste as merit and how you respond and that caste is response and environment. So it was
Speak up a little bit.
second is when we're talking about futures, and that's about stages where a large number of learning is coming from people like Bonaparte, who are looking at cyber.
Not for the past 20 years. I don't know what you guys are reading.
Okay, so basically looking at cyber worlds and also plant species to think about sort of friendships that are beyond.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that. It's too silly. So, read someone else. Questions have to have a certain level of seriousness. If you want me to talk about friendships between humans and plants, I honestly don't know what to say to you. So, shall I address these? Should I go to the podium? Okay, so Yasmin's right. Yasmin, right? Question. I can talk about how I would frame, how I would give content to universalism. But what made me puzzled was the second part of your question, which I don't know if it's a throwaway, which is if you do not wish to go back to the Enlightenment. I would just reject that, because I do want to go back to the Enlightenment.
Is there anything you can
Well, listen, the thing of it is, the kinds of universalisms that I would advise us to go back to are just intrinsically bound up with the Enlightenment. So it would be kind of false to say that. So let me give you an example. I think the essence of the Enlightenment was, well, you could find it in two people who were so in common. And I think at the heart of it is, I think it was Kant who expressed it and developed it the best, which is that, and this I think it is novel historically. We haven't yet found it in ancient Indian philosophy as far as I know. It was that the notion of the autonomous will, of agency, of the autonomous will as being what defines human being as opposed to motivation or action through instincts. And that is what's behind the notion of freedom. And that is what's behind Marx's notion of emancipation. It's quite shocking to see in the intellectual world, especially in what I would call the lumpen intelligence, the people on Twitter, the casualness with which the idea of emancipation and social contract and such is lampooned and rejected. I don't think it's possible to describe the vision, the emancipatory vision of socialism in the left, without notions of human autonomy and social contract. The reason I say this is every single element of Indian, Chinese, Middle Eastern history confirms that these people were no less motivated by a drive to resist exploitation and resist domination than were white people. But if that's true, it means they're motivated by a drive for lack of a better term, freedom, which is an expression of the autonomous will. Now, to my mind, that is, without that, you do not have emancipatory politics. What you have is some kind of tribal politics, one or the other. If that's the case, the content that I would give to today's universalism would be exactly that. Two basic elements. The Kantian notion of the autonomous will, and the Rousseauian notion of social contract, which is exactly the essence when Marx says socialism is an associated a community of associated producers, or association of producers. So, if you want to say, let's remold that so we don't draw on the Enlightenment, fine, go ahead and do that. But when something is there as a resource, I don't know why you wouldn't draw on it. So that may not be the answer you want, but I am fully committed. I don't think the Enlightenment was a European phenomenon. It was European geographically, but it's intrinsically human. It is not European any more than Newtonian physics is European. Newton discovered something universal, but it belongs to all of us. I think Kant discovered something universal, but it belongs to all of us. Just like Marx belongs to all of us. So I'm not troubled by a resort to the Enlightenment. The second question about Orientalism, I think it's indubitable that postcolonial theory has resurrected an Orientalist discourse. Orientalism is polite for racism. It does so in two ways. One is that, and this starts with Said. I have an article on Said that called Orientalism and its Afterlives, which I try to show, and I'm not the first. Ajaz Ahmed made the same argument. and some Middle Eastern Marxists also made the same argument. Said was the latest in a long string of radicals who had said that an orientalizing and racist discourse was used to justify colonialism. He was not the first to say that. What he was the first to say, though, was that this kind of discourse was not the result of colonialism, but is what created it. And the mindset that generated this discourse could be found as far back as the ancient Greeks. Which means, and this is what Quijano really runs with in his book, there is a European mindset, and that's a mindset that is driven predominantly, and that epistemologically is geared towards categorization and essentialism. And that's what drives it in colonialism. Now, first of all, that is a reified and highly essentialist view of European culture, and therefore reifies it in a way that's consistent with Orientalism. But when you come to the flip side, which is what Quijano and subalternists and Walter Mignolo are saying, they also essentialize what Eastern culture is. And they describe it in ways exactly like the European colonialists described it from the 1870s on. That natives in the colonized world do not use reason, do not use rationality, that they're community-oriented, they do not have a conception of individual interests, they do not have a conception of rights, etc., etc. They say the exact same things. But what is this other than essentializing Orientalist discourse? The funny thing about them is they say it, and when you point it out, they say, well, we didn't say it. Problem is, it's there in print. So what they rely on, this is where Spivak comes in, sheer power. They just terrorize you. They essentially come down and you say, if you don't agree with us, you'll never get a job. If you don't agree with us, we won't finish your PhD, or we won't let you study this. The thing is, once you abandon reason and rationality, all you have left is power. And this describes the essence of the internal academic culture of postcolonial theory today. It's subservience. This is why when I wrote my critique, Spivak comes out in an article and says, how dare you criticize an old man? What is to me? That's what she said. Caste, I mean, you know, the problem with looking at how they work on caste is this. There's what they say about how caste should be studied, and then there's what they actually do when they try to explain caste. And what they say when they describe how it should be studied is that it's cultural, it's discourse-based, etc., etc. And many of their empirical studies, in fact, go back. It sounds like it feels like you're reading Dumont when you read them. But there's a lot of their empirical work that's actually quite sound, but then that empirical work is going against their strictures. Quite often when you read a theorist, the test is to see, is the theorist being true to his theory, or her theory? Or are they abandoning the theory when it comes to actually doing their work? When they're true to their theory, the work is not very impressive or persuasive on caste. When the work on caste is impressive, it's because almost every turn they've abandoned the theory. That's bad.
Else, yeah, one. You ask when you see the
For the left to have, when they're to meaningfully talk about the left, it has to be an organized force. It has to be something that is making an impression on the political culture and the political dynamics of the day. Right now, across the world, including India, if you simply took away all the left parties, it would make almost no difference in the political culture. The left is either abandoned, the left, for it to survive, has to be a mobilizing force. It has to be in the lives of working people. It has to be embedded in them. It has to be articulating their demands. It has to be expressing their grievances, expressing their desires. But I would say by the 1990s, globally, that was largely a thing of the past. So you still have a party that calls itself socialist, or labor, or communist. Very few of these parties are actually doing what labor and socialist and communist parties were doing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They become Babu organizations. Their main electoral base now in the West is the professional class. And I'm not sure, because the studies in India, I'm not sure where the communists get their vote now. But the simple fact is they have 9 seats in the Lok Sabha. You'd think they'd be a little more humble. They're not. So I think So what's called the left now is actually a subset of the liberal intelligence. And that's why what's called the left is taken to be so obsessed with identity, culture, things like that. It's because they've taken over the discourse of the left and they pushed it toward the concerns of minorities and dominated groups within the professional class. What we call identity politics is not the way in which caste or race or ethnicity or gender is experienced by the poor. Identity politics addresses the way these forms of domination are experienced by elites. It's becoming elite discourse. That's the left today. Okay, that's, I should say left in quote marks, but it's not actually the left. It is simply a wing of the elite classes, whether it's in India or whether it's in the West. For the left to have any meaningful engagement with the culture again, it's going to have to look like the old time. What was happening what the Indian communists and the Congress socialists were doing in the 1920s and 30s, what the Western communists were doing. Until then, I think it's pretty dubious that you'd say that is. Now, can it happen again? I hope so. But until it happens again, those of us who still identify with this old movements, all you can do is try to say, this is not the left.
So a follow-up question. So when you say so you in the future you see if the leftist to actually relegate to the part importance or is it now simply a part of it? That's
Anti-oppression politics has to be intrinsic with the left. That is, non-class forms of oppression have to be central to the left. My point is identity politics is not anti-oppression politics. It's simply anti-discrimination. It's politics around the ceilings on upward mobility for the wealthier people. Anti-oppression politics will have to take up economics. Without it, it's not anti-oppression. Writing a book on this now to explain in more detail why that's.
When it comes to universalism or enlightenment categories or modernity as such, now one of the reasons that post-colonials or decolonials that they give that they want to abandon universal categories is because they think or they argue that the darker side of modernity is constitutive of modernity, which is racism or all forms of subordination or domination. For example, on one hand, if Kant was preaching universalism, on the other hand, he was denying that same universal reasons to global south. So they say that this darker side of modernity is constitutive of modernism or the universal category. So what are the chances if we are going back to the universal categories or enlightenment categories? And what are the chances that this darker side will not come up? Or I mean, how?
I just don't understand that principle. I'm aware of that principle.
Yeah.
All right, so you want to abandon the Enlightenment because it came with these darker categories.
Yeah, this is the constitutive.
Constitutive is a very strong word. I think what the most you can say is that it was part of it. Constitutive means that's what defines modernity. But actually, ethnically based slaughter, what we call kind of essentializing tribalism, actually constituted pre-modern politics. Now, I do agree that race per se is a modern category, but race is not the only antediluvian or primordial category we have. There's also these other ones, all of which were central to fascism. To my mind, fascism came out of a modern economy and a modern political system. But to say that the tropes and the cultural symbols essential to fascism are constitutive of modernity is a crazy exaggeration. What is constitutive of modernity is what I said. It's what you see for the first time. And what sets the Enlightenment apart from pre-modern forms of consciousness is the notion of the self-directed individual. Now, can we be sure that if we revive and revitalize Enlightenment categories, we won't get return of something like, but if you want a politics of guarantees, then religion is the place to go. Politics is an arena of struggle. And we can flip the question to the post-colonialists. What are the guarantees that your categories don't, in fact, lead to the same authoritarianism? Miguel Nanda has a very nice book right now and how post-colonial theory is being used by the far right in India and elsewhere. The trick to being a post-colonial theorist is to keep the light moving so nobody ever turns the questions back onto you. If you turn those questions back onto them, they fail in an instant. Because while the Enlightenment may have been culpable in the rise of far-right movements, it is also what drove the emancipatory movements, every single one of them. Whether labor, gender, race, caste, ethnicity, every single one of them was motivated by the central categories of the Enlightenment. I'd like to see a single one that post-colonial theory, as I said earlier, has in fact motivated. I don't know where.
Well, political economic interest of Palestinians does not lie with the any other region, but states, foreign states. Is the cause really good, or there can be some different life for politics?
I was hoping nobody would ask that question. I think the Palestinians are in a very sticky situation. Almost anything can happen. But if you do a sober analysis of the resources that they have available to them, they're not very good. Well, they realized this in the 1960s, after 1967, particularly when Fatah took up armed struggle. But by the 80s, even Fatah realized that armed struggle is not going on. The reason is simple. You can't fight a guerrilla war against one of the most powerful militaries in the world in your own territory. Because the response has been to go on and bomb them to smithereens every time we do anything, or to kill 100 Palestinians for every single Israeli who they want. I think the Palestinians are going to be the most dependent of any liberation movement ever on external support, including the highly unlikely phenomenon of an Israeli left. It doesn't exist right now. I mean, there's some leftists in Israel. There's no left in Israel. In the United States, I think in the middle to long run, support for Israel is going to plummet. Because the genocide is just so obvious. And even among younger Jews, the support for Israel is plummeting. And in a wider population, if you look demographically, people under the age of 40, Israel has lost them. It's lost them forever. So in the United States, I think resistance to funding Israel is going to grow over time. I don't know how much that'll be on its own. I think Palestinians need an Israeli government. I just don't see that on the horizon. So when anybody says, what do you recommend for the Palestinian movement? I mean, I can talk about being hopeful and struggling on it. That's not a strategy. And strategically, I just don't know where to help. They have a little bit. But I don't want to laugh to it.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for a very wonderful talk. My question is simply this: it is that can you read into class in the sense of
I'm sorry, that's a non-question. Nobody ever said you can.
exploitation be material only? It will not be material alone. It could be idealized. When that is why again the relations of caste, gender, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. If we define class in terms of exploitation, I think we have to factor in, along with capitalist relations, also caste, gender, and other non-class relations equally.
But nobody ever denied that. Can you think of any Marxist that's actually denied that?
So to say that identity politics is something that actually compromises class politics.
Because as I said, identity politics does not address the needs of the very subordinate groups that it claims to be speaking for, which means Dalits, women, black people, and SCSTs. That's my criticism.
How to do that?
I mean, that's a longer argument. You do it by giving them the resources to resist their domination, which are not going to be cultural, because their domination is not based on culture. Now, we may disagree. No form of domination is based on culture. Culture is what legitimizes it, right? It's what rationalizes it. All domination is based on material resources. Now, if that's the case, then if you want to actually address the needs of the hundreds of millions of STSTs, of women who are subordinated, it has to come through material redistribution.
Only that.
Yes.
Don't have ideas.
Ideas will follow in their way. You can scream at upper caste all you want, you can tell them to be better.
Why don't you then see that in India, material resources are concentrated on upper caste? Why does it correspond? Culture.
Because
Time class.
so there's a difference between describing and analyzing. If you describe the lives of upper castes, you can see that they're also culturally dominant and they have material resources. But it's an analytical question to ask whether it's the cultural dominance that gives them the material resources, or whether it's their material dominance that allows them to shape their culture. I'm sorry, but if you're in a university, you should at least be able to make this distinction. So, if it's the material resources that give them the power to define the culture and the power to keep subordinate castes in their place, it's just logically the case that you have to give the lower caste the material resources to resist that domination. You're confusing causation and the symptoms of causation.
You say that, pregnancy has to be given to class,
Economic resources.
economic resources.
Now, and your questions have to end at some point. Last question. You just finish it. Finish it. Your last point.
My only understanding was this, that you need not give primacy only to class aspect. It could be ideation aspect as well, on the aspect, and they work together.
We disagree.
It's not one.
No. Primacy does not mean exclusiveness. Primacy means this is the core of your strategy. It does not mean you ignore everything else. Yeah. So primacy has to be given the material world, material resources. And you also work on the culture. Point is, if you do not have a redistribution of material resources, the cultural work is meaningless. It'll get you nowhere.
My only submission is that, sir, agreeing that there is class exploitation. I say that equal weightage should be given to non-class exploitation.
You said that. I just disagree.
Yeah.
Right. Let's move on. So I had to.
हिंदी में सवाल भारत में एक बार
अगर समझ आ गया मैं जवाब दे दूंगा, नहीं समझ आया मैं पूछ लूंगा, थोड़ा अंग्रेजी में बोलता हूँ.
आदिवासी समुदाय के बारे में बार बार बात की जाती है कि वो ऑन्टोलॉजिकली डिफरेंट है और मॉडर्निटी जहाँ पहुँचना चाहती है वो वहाँ पर पहले से ही हो है. अब ये आर्गुमेंट कोई कल्चर वाला दे तो ठीक समझ में आता है, लेकिन माओइस्ट पॉलिटिक्स जो उनको मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन से एक्सप्लॉयटेशन के कारण मोबिलाइज कर रही है, उनकी तरफ से भी ये आर्गुमेंट आता है या शेप ऑफ आर्गुमेंट की नियमगिरी है तो उनको से नियम राजा देख रहे हैं और आदिवासियों का ये बिलीफ है, तो इसको भी समझना चाहिए. लेकिन हम देख रहे हैं कि उनका एक्सप्लॉयटेशन मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन में बदलाव के कारण हो रहा है. तो इन एक ही समुदाय में दो फ्रेगमेंट्स को कैसे दिखाएं?
देखिए, समझना तो जरूर चाहिए. अगर आप मटीरियलिस्ट हैं, मैं अंग्रेजी में थोड़ा बोल, हाँ, if you're a materialist, you have to understand culture. But to understand the culture is not the same thing as internalizing that culture. So, for Dinesh Chakrabarty, for example, he says you cannot take a religion seriously until you're willing to accept that the statements made by the religious people are true. That's nonsense. So, suppose I'm a doctor and I'm treating a disease. I ask you, what are you doing? What are you feeling? I have to take what you're feeling seriously. What if you said, spirits are in my stomach and they're making me hurt? Do I have to believe? So, Chakrabarty raises this as an epistemological argument, but epistemologically it's nonsensical. Now, I have to take your view seriously. अगर तुम्हें पेट में दर्द हो रहा है, I take it seriously. अगर तुम्हें लग रहा है कि भूत प्रेत दर्द कर रहे हैं, I take it seriously. That doesn't mean I have to believe it. If Maoists are in those regions, they should take seriously what those tribals and what these communities are saying. It's quite another to then adopt it as a view. I don't think one follows from the other at all. So the notion that there's an ontological difference, I mean, that's a hugely ambitious claim. It means they live in a different universe. Not that they have different beliefs from you, but they live in a different universe. Makes no sense. What are they fighting for? Land, water, rights. It sounds pretty disworldly to me. It's nonsense. It's because urban high caste Indians love to exoticize tribalism. You know, people talk about how Westerners exoticize the East. The social distance between a typical English-speaking Indian urban PhD and a tribal is more than the social distance between them and the American academics who they write for. It's easy for urban Indians to exoticize these folks, and that's why they talk about them exactly the same way as colonialists. But the essence of egalitarian, call it socialist project is to respect them as human beings. And you are not respecting them by saying, "Hi, bache keh rahe hain, acha acha." You keh rahe ho ki tumhe bhoot pret maar rahe hain, theek, koi baat nahi. That's respect. That's paternalism. Respect is to say, you deserve the same rights that I have. You have a right to the same kind of life that I have. And yeah, you may have these beliefs, but then I have a grandmother who thinks you're not getting down from the mountains. So what? Let me not take that seriously.
Thank you for the lecture. My question is mainly about the 1997 lecture about the fact that in those regions where those people were facing economic hardships, they are badly impacted by austerity measures, and it's only there is it's mostly right as a more prepared there, and they have turned to xenophobia. So I was actually that if they got a kind of economic hardships, then there should be rise of some political party who kind of propagate for their economic rights, not this political parties who kind of doing the same, is doing the worst, even worse to their own rights. So means how one could understand
That's what one is hoping for. One is hoping that happens. But I said in response to the earlier question in my talk was, we can't be certain that it will happen. And look, there's reasons why. One is that the actual, what we call the ecology of economic production, how production is organized, how firms are organized, how they relate to each other, is very different today than it was in the 1990s. So the way we go about organizing labor is also true in India. If you look at the new industrial zones, even in the NCR and beyond, the way in which labor is being brought in, the way in which the technical division of labor is organized, it's not what it was in the 1940s and 50s when the communists were organizing in Kanpur and Mumbai and places like that. The left, such as it is, has not yet figured out how to organize in those places. It doesn't have a lot of time because the ecological crisis is worsening over time. Secondly, back in the 1920s and 10s, people who call themselves the left had some things in common. They held to a conception of universal interests. They insisted on the priority of material interests over cultural study. They insisted that the political agent for human emancipation will be labor. And most importantly, they sought to make themselves relevant to workers with a humility. This was really true of the Indian communists. I mean, many Indian communists came from high caste background, but they lived very simple, very frugal lives. That's all gone to the floor. The industrial organization has changed. Inter-firm organization has changed. And the left, what's called the left, mostly despises the left. So I can't be sure this is going to change soon enough. I hope it changes. But it's going to have to rise out of the ashes of the current left. Current left is an albatross that hangs on the neck of the political culture. And it's sad to say, because Indian academic fashions follow the US about a 10 to 15 year lag, I see the same thing happening here. I don't know how it's going to change.
So, this was question of the joblessness. That because in joblessness, that people are just jobless. It's like these people want to be exploited just because they don't have job.
Yeah, John Robinson, remember your famous quote, and you must know this. In capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited.
Next piece.
Yes.
So I just want to know more on one of the most popular issues, the issue of reservation. The issue of reservation. The quick disclaimer is that I'm neither against reservation nor in favor of reservation. So it is really one burning issue in reservation. So I just believe that reservation has is closely intrinsically associated with politics of stars. Yeah, that reservation demonstrates that we don't have that much resources or capital so that the citizens will be benefited. So there's some sort of, or say, there are different categories of people, person category. So some portion or some section of that category should benefit from it. And then lies in trickle down people, some technical categories, of course, value categories of any social categories will benefit that and then resources based in the circulate downward. So how and coming the case of Korea, this as far as I understand that when the government, successive government is trying to policies on regulation, they are giving primacy to social factor. They more than economic factor. So how do you look into the industry? They are giving less importance to the government than they give more weightage to social impact.
Yeah, two questions. One is, what do we make of the fact that the Indian government gives more salience to social factors than economic factors? And secondly, what do we make of reservations generally as a strategy? So I think that in a country like India, looking at social factors rather than economic factors by identifying certain historically oppressed castes or communities. The historically oppressed also are typically the most economically disadvantaged, but there's a huge overlap. So you can sort of substitute one for the other. So when you say we're going to give reservations to Dalits and we define the Dalits as a particular social category or SCSTs as a social category, it also happens to be very, very poor. So you are also de facto giving reservations to people who are economically disadvantaged. Now, personally, I don't have anything against focusing on economic disadvantage. So I know that there are some high castes who will also benefit from it because of it. But it's just the fact that if you're economically disadvantaged, you are going to have difficulty finding a job, even if you are high caste. It's also true that if you're lower caste, by now there is some degree of socioeconomic differentiation within the scheduled castes. And it is true that a lot of the reservations are going to be a creamy layer, the upper crust within, which I think goes against the spirit of it. The reason it goes against that same spirit is there's no such thing as trickling down. This idea that if you reserve seats for the more advantaged, it will trickle down. We need some data to show that that's actually happening, and I don't see that happening. Now, that's then the issue of social versus economic. What do you think of as a strategy? Well, I think it's extremely limited as a strategy because you frame the question very well. Reservations become attractive in a culture of scarcity. So in an economy that's a very slow growth economy, especially where growth is not generating jobs, fight over reservations, you're fighting over fronts. And furthermore, if there are 60 or 70 crore people who are in precarious unemployment or who belong to these dominated communities, reservations will help how many? What percentage are actually going to benefit from reservations? Tiny, minuscule. So it cannot be a recipe for justice. What it is a recipe for ameliorating the degree of injustice. But that's not the same thing as providing justice. So to my mind, again, going back to the economic question, without focusing on job creation rather than on the distribution of the jobs, you are not going to help the vast majority of the very people who are the targets of the reservations. So you need to have a program of economic transformation, of economic upliftment, so that they're not fighting for reservations, so that they can actually apply for jobs effectively, competitively, so that they have social rights to water, to housing. And to my mind, those rights should be independent of whether or not they have a job. These should be social rights. None of that comes through identity politics. None. Not a single element of it. All of it comes through the politics of social transformation and economic redistribution. This is why I say, if you actually are interested in the economic emancipation of those socially stigmatized groups, you have to take up economic movements. Otherwise, you're simply reflecting the aspirations of the better off within them.
Last question. Yeah.
My question is that we will bring up the solution as economic transformation and social transformation. So when you see the back in all over the world, mostly there is this parliament because the has come to elections. How do you see relation between this electoral politics, this working class movement, and this transformation to socialism? Is it possible for any real economic social transformation through electoral politics?
So everybody heard the question, I think it's a very important question. Is it possible to have real economic transformation through, let's say, a prioritization of electoral politics, or even an exclusive focus on electoral politics? The answer there is no. I don't see that happening. Because even if you get elected into office, you don't really have power. In capitalism, power is in the hands of capital. You can have office, but you won't have power. To have power, you need to have some kind of leverage against capital. That requires mobilization, social movements, in particular movements of labor. This is no less true in India than it is in the West. A left that is an electoral left in India that has scaled back on its mobilizations, on the people's movements, on organizing, will be a left that is too weak to do anything. You might do a little something here and there. Having office is not triggered. Holding office does give you some power, very limited. And again, in response to the earlier question about the left, that's why I'm not willing to say that the left is going to be better, because the amount of work it's going to take to revitalize these organizations, the amount of commitment it's going to take on capital once again, but it's so much easier to simply want some reservations here, or some affirmative action there, or some cultural adjustments there. It's going to require going back to a culture where being a leftist meant committing yourself to a lifetime of sacrifice and struggle.
Okay, last two. You go first.
Yes.
I was thinking I really like to differentiate between the consent and the rationalization, because as I'm understanding, you said that culture is something which legitimizes and rationalizes, but domination is not based on the consent. So I'm really confused between how consent is different from the rationalization. This rationalization coming out of as a individual resistance, because there is a cost and risk involved.
I should say this is something I have a much longer and detailed argument about in the class matrix. So what I'm going to do is sort of abbreviate that and summarize it, but I would urge you to take a look at that. To my mind, all domination, whether class or non-class, is based on economic dominance. The reason I say that is that I don't think base social dominance on culture has to mean the following: that the people who are at the bottom accept their domination because they've internalized a culture. But if that domination is actually hurting them, it's hard to imagine that they would simply accept it because a prophet or a priest or a school teacher told them. So why do they accept it? To my mind, they accept it because they're powerless to do anything about it. So they're motivated. So I distinguish between motivation and rationalization. To my mind, the motivation to accept your position as a worker or as a woman in patriarchy or as a lower caste who's being discriminated against, the motivation to accept it is that you have no other option. Either you're powerless to fight against it or you don't have the resources to exit and leave. If that's the case, then what is the role of consent? I don't believe consent is the right word to describe what they're doing. What they're doing is resigning themselves to their situation. Now, when you resign yourself to a very unpleasant situation, you are likely to cook up some stories to make it easier for yourself. That's what the rationalization is. They rationalize it themselves. I also believe in ruling classes, the only place you find consent to class is among the winners, is among the top. But they have to rationalize it. They come up with an fictional discourse to justify why they're treating everybody else like dirt and why they take everything for themselves. And their rationalization is, we deserve it, we're more talented, we're better, God likes us more. Whereas the rationalization on the part of the poor is, God made it this way, it's natural, and sometimes we're undeserving. We must have done something in the past. But these are all ways to cope with the situation. They're not the motivation for why you accept the situation.
When you're close to it, speak up for us in here also.
Turn your back to me.
Going on to extreme points, and I will thing or the post-colonial. I try to understand the key concept of the post-colonial the hybridity. It's a reverse to the mixing of culture. I want to understand, sir, why hybridity is not what's wrong with
Concept.
within this post-colonial. To make it more clear, once it will impact the Israel and Palestinian conflict. What stops Israel to think of binational state? In the context of the
Well, either you can ask the question, why Israel reduced the binational state, or you can say you want me to force hybridity into them. Because I think the reason Israel doesn't want it has nothing to do with hybridity. Hybridity is such a vague word, you can take it, you can define it to mean anything you want. So, in my mind, hybridity doesn't work because it's backwards. It has no meaning. It just means things are mixed. Is that an insight? Is it an insight to say things are kind of mixed up? We start with that. We start with the fact that everything's interrelated, and then we try to instill order into analysis. That said, to answer your question, Israel doesn't want a binational state because it's afraid that Palestinians will outnumber them, and it will no longer be a Jewish state. The Israeli political establishment is absolutely committed to an ethnic state. That's the only reason. And if you want to know, ask them. They tell you, they're very open about it. This is to be a Jewish state, and if we allow all the Palestinians full political rights, they'll outnumber us.
even though they don't have institution.
So now you're complaining to me that they lie.
This is not.
But look, it's a cool world out there. So you're gonna have to get used to the fact that ruling buses lie.
Much as we're enjoying this continued conversation, I think it was being very important in this room. So I think I'll cut short this my times and my questions, and invite you all to join us for coffee and samosa outside. It's still being set up, so please wait and have your tea and samosa when you go. But before you go, thank you so much, Vivek, for all this. I'm sure you'll be out there outside of a tea, but at least there's some police there. Thank you.